Hello, everyone. I'll open it up. People are still pouring in, but we will start being good Germans, being on time. Welcome, dear guests of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation of America's North Rhine-Westphalia. My name is Benjamin Becker. I'm the Managing Director of America's North Rhine-Westphalia. That's a transatlantic NGO here in Western Germany. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion on transatlantic perspectives on old and new anti-Semitism. Let me in particular warmly welcome our most distinguished experts, Professor Alvin Rosenfeld from Indiana University. Welcome, Professor, great to have you here. Deidre Berger in her new capacity as chair of the Jewish Digital Cultural Recovery Project Foundation, joining us from Berlin. Great to have you, Deidre. And our moderator, the one and only from Cologne, Arnd Henze. Great to have you. Let me also in particular warmly welcome our trusted cooperation partner, Dr. Christian Köke from the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Now on tonight's panel. The idea for tonight's panel actually came up during a past discussion that some of you may have followed half a year ago. We were at the height of the US presidential election campaigns, and we talked about different subjects. One of them was religion in US politics, especially in the election campaign, and we had a special topic where Deidre Berger covered Jewish voters, Jewish American voters. We had another expert, a professor from Augsburg University, Britta Waldschmidt-Nelson, who covered Christian voters, and Arnd Henze was our most skillful navigator through the discussion. By the end, the panel scratched upon a well-known surface, a notorious surface, namely anti-Semitism in the context of social and ethnic groups within the US. Or to put it differently, old anti-Semitism and new anti-Semitism. Old, of course, being in the sense that culminated in the Third Reich, new anti-Semitism from various post-war directions. Now, the panel was convinced that we should do a follow-up discussion, and that's what brought us here tonight. With a slightly changed panel, we have Deidre Berger and Arnd Henze, who are well known to you, and we have our most distinguished guest from Bloomington, Indiana, Professor Alvin H. Rosenfeld from Indiana University. Panelists will dive right into the topic, and they will be briefly introduced by Mr. Henze. He will dive directly into everything, who, lucky us, is an expert on both religion and transatlantic relations. Just briefly, he's a TV editor at Germany's largest broadcaster at WDR. He was a correspondent on foreign relations in ARD's capital studio in Berlin. He studied Protestant and economical theology in Göttingen, Heidelberg, and at Berkeley, and is also a successful author with a book on democracy within the Protestant Church. So if you haven't read it, check it out. Now, final remarks, technical remarks. You know the drill after 1 year. If you want to participate, please do so. There is a Q&A button or F&A button below there, depending on your language settings. We, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and America House have websites. You will find us, I'm pretty sure. And we have newsletter subscriptions. So if you like tonight, despite the hefty topic, please do come back. And last but by no means least, thanks a lot to all people involved in the background, in particular my colleague Katharina, who handles technical things. So if you don't notice anything specific, that's a good sign. And I'm pretty sure things will go smoothly again. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Köke from the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. I wish us all a most insightful discussion. And yeah, Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Well, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Mr. Becker, dear Benjamin, dear distinguished speakers of tonight, I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Maybe some of you don't know the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. It is a political institution which bears the name of the first Chancellor of the Bundesrepublik, which lived some meters away from me here in Röndorf, it's the south of Bonn. A special warm welcome to all our participants from the other side of the transatlantic bridge. As I was told, there are some people from the US, focused mainly on domestic events. This is, as far as I remember, the first discussion event where we have so much participants from the US. So I cordially thank you that you are spending your time in the middle of the day to be part of this discussion about anti-Semitism. It's been decades, no, not decades, it's many years that we, the political foundation, Konrad-Adenauer, cooperate with the America House, a beacon of the transatlantic dialogue in the western part of Germany, as I might say. We are very thankful that we are allowed to be part of your important dialogue program, Benjamin. Thank you for being with us tonight. A cordial thank you as well to our panelists tonight, to Deidre Berger, formerly AJC, the Jewish organization that brought me through the US in a breathtaking excursion in a different century. That's decades ago, but it is very close to my remembrance. And to Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, a distinguished expert in research on anti-Semitism, and of course to Arnd Henze, the moderator of this digital panel discussion tonight. It's not my task to reflect more on that, to go into it. There's too much competence in this digital room to continue me wandering in the dark. So let's turn the lights to the panel and hear what experts can say to us on that matter. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much. Deidre, Professor Rosenfeld, Herr Henze, it's your floor. And I'm very glad to have you all together with the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to again sort of lead us through this next 90 minutes. This is such a fascinating format and setting, and I don't want to waste time on something that would take time to mention at least part of the accomplishments of our two distinguished panelists. All of you have signed in, you have read the invitation, and there's already sort of something mentioned, and there's much more to say. I think you are more probably interested to hear what they have to say today on a topic that's already very, very complex and difficult to handle in our own societies here in Germany as well as in the United States. But we have tonight the chance to broaden our perspective by putting it in this transatlantic context and to see how sort of a completely different setting tackles the same issues that we are dealing here in our society in Cologne in Germany or in Indianapolis or maybe in other parts of the United States that have a different social environment as well. The problem with anti-Semitism is there is no such thing as a clear, timeless definition of what anti-Semitism is all about. And this is not because you can't identify anti-Semitism, but it's more a sort of a set of attitudes, of stereotypes, of conspiracy myths that are so deeply rooted in many religions, in cultural, in ideological formations going through centuries. But like a virus, these stereotypes can mutate and adopt easily to new issues, new debates, and infect and poison societies trying to deal with new challenges. We see this right away, right now, with the Corona protest, where the same anti-Semitic stereotypes that they played out years before in other debates now sort of poison the debate on Corona and the measures societies take to handle this pandemic. How do we identify anti-Semitism in these debates? How do we identify the underlying attitudes? How do we identify the actors who try to poison our debates? And how do we confront anti-Semitism rather than ignoring or even worse, tolerating it in our own environment or even more difficult in parts of the society we do not belong to? If you want to hear how anti-Semitism plays out right now in debates, in very polarized debates we see in the United States, as well as how it plays out in our polarization that we are facing more and more here in Germany. And I'd like to start by asking Professor Rosenfeld to give us his perspective from the American side, putting sort of your decade-long research on anti-Semitism sort of in very few minutes on current challenges, current questions we are facing with, in your context, in the United States. how is anti-Semitism playing out right now, and how are we trying to confront it? Are you trying to confront it in these controversies?
Thank you so much, Mr. Henze, for that introduction. The issue is complicated. I'm glad to do my best to try to clarify certain aspects of it. Let me begin in a very introductory way by saying that outside of Israel, more Jews live in the United States than in any other country. Most are fully integrated, well-educated, by and large successful. And until relatively recently, over the last couple decades, I would say, most Jews in America have felt at home, at ease, and have done very well here. That's begun to change. And it's begun to change because since about the turn of the millennium, American Jews now realize they're no more immune to hostility against them as Jews than Jews in Europe. As a result of that, and this is new for America, not for Europe, as a result of that, I don't know that there is a synagogue, a Jewish school, a Jewish community center, a Jewish federation in America today without security. That's new for us. We've not lived that way. I know European Jews have. So that fact of pretty omnipresent security underlines, Mr. Henze, the very question that you just put before us. American Jews realize they're not immune, and I'll give some detail to that. But before that, let me take a stab at the definitional question, because that is important. We need to know what it is, what kinds of anti-Semitism we're facing today and talking about in our discussion. For all the reasons you stated before, it's difficult to come up with a consensus definition that will encompass every form of hostility that Jews may run into today. But I jotted down just for today's session, we might think of anti-Semitism as hostility to Jews based on an irrational and exaggerated fear of Jews, resentment of Jews, suspicion of Jews, distrust of Jews, hatred of Jews, contempt for Jews, etc. And while such hostility has been a threatening presence in numerous countries at various times, what drives it, as you correctly said, is not always the same, nor are the forms it takes always alike. For our purposes today, if I may, I'll just take a moment to define two prominent kinds of anti-Semitism. And in doing this, I'm drawing on a very important book recently published by a British philosopher, Bernard Harrison. The book is called Blaming the Jews. And he distinguishes between what he calls social anti-Semitism and political or ideological anti-Semitism. And I'll just sketch in the bases of those momentarily. Social anti-Semitism is driven chiefly by an extreme dislike of Jews, and its goal is social exclusion, the marginalization of people deemed to be different, unlikable, disagreeable, even detestable. And when Jews are viewed in this way, the impulse is to keep at a distance from them, to ostracize them, or to cast them out. Hence, the efforts over many years to segregate or exclude Jews from certain neighborhoods, lines of work, social circles, schools and universities, hospitals even, and the like. And in its most extreme expressions, the proponents of social anti-Semitism seek even to banish Jews from the countries where they reside or ghettoize them within restricted areas. And we can all think back historically to the forced exile of Jews from England and Spain in the Middle Ages, and the establishment of Jewish ghettos in Venice and other Italian cities. We're not seeing anything that extreme today, but social anti-Semitism remains present in various forms. By contrast, what Professor Harrison calls political or ideological anti-Semitism is driven far more by fear of Jews than a dislike or contempt for Jews, and its goals are different and they're more destructive. Those possessed by such feelings regard Jews as a threat to their very well-being and to the general health and stability of society. They believe that Jews are conspiratorially organized to seize power through their penetration and control of major political and cultural institutions, financial markets, the media, and other areas of civil society. And in pursuit of these aims, Jews are allegedly responsible for human suffering on such a large scale as to be seen as agents of evil, thought to be aligned with Satan or the devil. They are imagined as carrying out demonic deeds on a cosmic scale. And you'll forgive me for quoting Hitler, but he's apt here. I'm quoting from Mein Kampf, where he referred to Jews more than once as veritable devils. And as he put it, their activities, if left unchecked, and this is a quote from him in English translation, must ultimately result in the collapse of human civilization and the consequent devastation of the world. To those who think about Jews in these terms, and unfortunately many still do, the goal is not the social exclusion of Jews, but their total elimination. And given the magnitude of Jewish wickedness, which they imagine, simply to avoid Jews or to keep them at arm's length is not enough. They need to be destroyed. And some of the examples I can put before you a little bit later in discussion that have occurred in America are, in fact, consonant with this form of murderous and not just social exclusion, anti-Semitism. I'm sure we'll also get around to talking about it as well, but among those people who want to see not the modification or reform of the state of Israel, but its elimination, likewise, something similar to annihilationist anti-Semitism is at work, but that I'm sure a bit later in the discussion. All of this by way of introduction. I'm sure Deidre Berger will want to say some things about the German and general European situation.
Well, thank you so much for this very rich first input in our discussion. I'd like to mention that we have this Q&A segment of our Zoom platform here that you can place your questions for the future, for the further discussion. But now to Deidre, I mean, we also have these two forms of anti-Semitism in our German context, the social anti-Semitism and the ideological anti-Semitism. But here I think we have a generation of Jews living in Germany who never saw anything else than that they have to have security protection, that they have to go to school under heavy security measures. So how does anti-Semitism play out in our German context right now? Oh, we need to give you some sound.
Okay, I forgot. There we go. Thank you, Arnd, for the question. And first, I just would like to thank the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and America House for having me back and for sponsoring this. And perhaps to mention that Recently, I was speaking for a group at the American Jewish Committee about Konrad-Adenauer and his relationship to the Jewish world, which reminded me of a number of things we might touch on later, because I think it was very important in the understanding of how modern Germany emerged in trying to deal with the Holocaust and in launching compensation payments that made it possible for Germany to again be an actor on the global stage. There's no question that if Konrad Adenauer had not sought the link to the Western Alliance through the connection to Israel and the Jewish world, that it wouldn't have worked. It's a very interesting chapter of history. To touch on issues of security, to go back to what Alvin said, Alvin, I would very much underline what you said about American Jews no longer feeling immune. And it hit me very strongly when in 2017, there was a rash of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, one of which was a cemetery desecration in St. Louis, where I come from. And it was the cemetery where my grandparents are buried. And it was, thank goodness, not their graves specifically, but it was an overwhelming feeling of the security doesn't exist here anymore. If my own family can't rest in peace in a Jewish cemetery in the United States, which is where we thought we were protected more than any place in the world, it was a very unsettling feeling, I can say that. And every time I'm there to, as Alvin said, to encounter the higher levels of security, it's not a surprise for me, having lived now in Europe for several decades. But it changes a lot of attitudes, I think, and has opened up in some ways. When I speak to American Jews, I think there's more empathy for the situation in Europe, that it's not a special problem in that sense, although it has different historical roots. Here in Germany, just today, I think we had news that was typical of what's going on. There was a report put out by a group called RIAS, the Research and Information Center on Anti-Semitism here in Berlin, and it showed a 13% increase in anti-Semitism in 2020. An increase? We had a year of the pandemic where people hardly saw each other, and nonetheless we had an increase. Not only that, but disturbing is that 1 in every 5 cases of these, there was nearly 1,000 cases that were reported, were related to the pandemic, which is going back to what Alvin said, this feeling of fear that the Jews are taking over the world, that the Jews are responsible. One of the incidents they reported was a Jewish woman in her own apartment building, someone tacking up a note to Dr. Corona that was addressed to her. I mean, there were very direct statements about it. One of the leaders of the movement here, a man named Attila Hildmann, who was had some minor fame as a cook, as a chef, a cookbook author, and became a rabid anti-corona believer, and used liberally, unfortunately, and continues to, anti-Semitic slogans to the point where he's been banned from speaking very often. I think he's in Turkey now. It's typical of what's going on here. They also pointed out in this report that the internet has, unfortunately, the anti-Semitism has exploded exponentially. And I think this is part of the corona pandemic has brought us all more to our virtual world, and it's created even more openings for anti-Semitism. There's been a very late and insufficient awareness on the part of social media companies that this can't be allowed to continue completely unrestrained, the amount of anti-Semitism. And this is a transatlantic issue. This isn't just a German issue. I think one of the big problems, Arndt, that we're seeing is that there's this attitude in Germany and in much of Europe that in fact the problem of anti-Semitism was overcome in the wake of the Holocaust. That we learned the lessons of history, people said, and we learn about the Holocaust in school, and so we don't have that problem here anymore. And if you don't recognize a problem, it's very difficult to combat it. You can't begin to describe it. If people don't report it, there's lots of reasons it's underreported, or if it's only reported, as Alvin pointed out, as a political problem, but not as a social problem, which is where a large number of these incidents happen, then we just don't understand how much of a daily part of the lives of Jews living in Germany and actually all of Europe that it is. And it's often also a problem because it's very much scorned, of course, to be anti-Semitic, and everyone is quick to assure others, but I'm not an anti-Semite, while expressing ideas and stereotypes that lead down the path of anti-Semitic hatreds and antipathies very quickly. So what Alvin was saying, where do we find the definition? It's a gray area. We don't always know, but what we do know are those on the receiving end, those of us who live lives as Jews, and even those who aren't consciously Jewish in that sense, we all feel the impact of it, and not just Jews. And I think this is also part of the definition of anti-Semitism. It's everyone perceived as being in alignment with the Jewish cause. And the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, talks about those perceived as Jews. And we've seen that happening more and more in Europe. Just briefly to touch on Europe, so we don't just talk about Germany, I will mention that just this morning in Paris, at the Sciences Po, which is an extremely prestigious institute of political science, where Emmanuel Macron went, among other important French politicians. This morning, there was anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist graffiti on the facade of the Institute. Several days ago, a high court in France upheld the lower court decision that the perpetrator of a brutal anti-Semitic attack against a Jewish woman in Paris, Sarah Halimi, in 2017, could not be tried because he was in a marijuana-induced delirium. These are all signs of the inability to recognize the consequences of anti-Semitism and holding perpetrators accountable. And I think that this has been a very large problem throughout Europe. Much has been done in recent years, and we can go into it later. I mean, it's certainly a different situation than 20 years ago in terms of political awareness, even in part public awareness. But we're really at the beginnings in many ways. Most police and law enforcement officers in Germany and in Europe don't get any training to recognize anti-Semitism. Most school teachers get no training. And they say, well, we learned about the Holocaust in school. That kind of average knowledge of the Holocaust is insufficient as teachers and educators to counter the anti-Semitic attitudes that we're seeing in classrooms. We have all across the board the relevant sectors of society who encounter anti-Semitism all the time. The sports field. There's unbelievable levels to this day, particularly in minor leagues, of anti-Semitism. The Maccabi teams here in Germany, which are sponsored by their Jewish clubs, although they're not only Jewish players, are bombarded with anti-Semitism. There's so much everyday anti-Semitism that it's difficult for those who don't live in this world, I think, to understand it. And I think it's important to know that while there's positive things to say about Jewish life and the fight against anti-Semitism, we have a very real problem we're still facing.
Thank you, Deidre. I think you both mentioned that it doesn't need real Jews for this political anti-Semitism because it's not based on real experience, real encounter with Jews, and it's not based on facts, and it's not based sort of on things that can be debated in a rational way. So my question is, we live in very polarized societies, and we live in a time where sort of the fake news environment became sort of part of political campaigning, part of sort of polarizing this society. Mr. Rosenfeld, how much did this politics of fake news sort of feed anti-Semitism and sort of encourage an environment where anti-Semitism could grow?
You're right, Mr. Henze, to put the emphasis on the environment, because the environment certainly is very overwrought. If I could wish for one thing and have it come true, it would be for people to sober up and calm down and be less stimulated by and given to irrational notions of all kinds. What we're seeing is the opposite. In fact, America certainly is a badly polarized, fractured society, and it shows up in all kinds of ways. The pandemic is not the cause of it, but it's one contributing factor. And we also get crazy notions about who's behind, who's responsible for the coronavirus. There are some people in this country even have referred to it as the Jew flu. Well, it's not a flu and it wasn't caused by Jews to begin with, but there's a long history, as we know, of accusing Jews of medical contamination of larger populations and the like. So yes, fake news is both symptomatic of a very uneasy, overwrought, emotionally almost out of control time, and a contributor to that as well. And part of this fake news is to find who in the world is responsible for the dilemmas that we face. And Jews have traditionally been a scapegoat for people who are unhappy and want to know what the sources of their unhappiness are. So time and again, we hear the name George Soros, the Hungarian-born American businessman and philanthropist. His name is often coupled with that of the Rothschild family, as if it's conceivable that Soros and the Rothschilds are in league with one another conspiratorially to control the situation and make it still worse. Most people, of course, won't buy into that, but some do, as they do notions that it was Jews who really caused the defeat of President Trump. So just as they talk about a Jew flu, they sometimes talk about something called a Jew Coup, as in coup d'etat. So those of us who still know how to think clearly stand back from this, look at it and say, crazy, absolutely nuts. How we deal with it is another matter, because it's very difficult to connect with people whose lives are phantasmagorical. The Jews that they hold responsible for their problems, the country's problems, the world's problems, are people they've never met before. They're imaginary Jews, but they sit in their heads and hearts in these overheated, exaggerated ways. Recently, I was asked by someone who knows that I spend day and night monitoring anti-Semitism, trying to understand anti-Semitism and the like. And I was asked, what have I discovered that can change the head and the heart of a real hardcore anti-Semite? It's a good question. What can change the head and the heart of a hardcore anti-Semite? And my answer is, I've discovered nothing. Nothing at all that can appeal to those people. Well, having said that, I'll say the obvious, I'm an educator. And lots of other people are also involved in trying to take the sting out of some of this toxic stuff through opening people's eyes to the history of anti-Semitism, the real facts of Jewish life. When people ask me, what can we do to calm it down? I say, sit together over lunch and have a bowl of chicken soup with matzo balls in it. And maybe by just doing that, acting in a friendly way with one another over something good to eat and talking rationally, maybe there's a better way ahead. But it's a difficult problem.
There's this group of hardcore anti-Semites that you talked about, but there are also those that Deidre already mentioned who sort of start sentences with "I'm not an anti-Semite, but."
Right.
And I think that are the gray zones that we need to tackle. I mean, we have
Yes.
polls that show, for example, that up to 40% of the population say Jews are talking too much of the Holocaust because they want to get money out of it, or these kind of stereotypes that are very, very sort of prevalent, almost in the mainstream of society. So Deidre, if we move a little bit back from this hardcore conspiracy-driven anti-Semites and to look about sort of anti-Semite stereotypes within sort of the mainstream society, how do we deal with that?
It's a very good question and an important one, and I would reinforce what Alvin just said about the importance of reaching out to a broader audience and not trying to focus on those who are really hardcore anti-Semites, if they even admit it. And I think a lot of people hold anti-Semitic stereotypes out of ignorance because it's just part of the world they grew up in. They've never questioned it. They've never gotten information to the contrary. So I think, for instance, if Alvin would share his recipe for matzo balls, matzo ball soup. Sorry to put you on the spot here, Alvin. But I think more knowledge of everyday life in the Jewish world, of Jewish history, culture, religion that's not linked only to the Holocaust or to the Crusades, which is all that most school children encounter. There's very little they learn about Jewish life, past and present. And I think that's an extremely important part of what can help change attitudes. I think that there really needs to be a concerted outreach to specific sectors of society. It's too much to say everybody needs to learn, but as I mentioned before, I think we can have a real impact on teachers. There are no real courses, as far as I know, in Germany within the teacher training institutes that are parts of the university that address anti-Semitism. There's very little done, for instance, at theological seminaries for future pastors and priests. There's almost nothing done in terms of police or in terms of justice officials or law enforcement officials or government officials. I think there are so many places where we can say it's all too, instead of saying it's all too much, let's say, let's address that group of people and see if we can find the multipliers, start giving people more information, take people on trips to Israel, help them encounter Jewish life, help them also understand the Holocaust in a way that's relevant for today. And I think we need to find new approaches. We are unfortunately at the point where we are losing the last voices of these survivors. There's a handful left, but really very few. So how can we reach young people today? The compelling nature of talking to a survivor is no longer there. The videos are important. It's not quite the same. We can talk to the next generations who have been, of course, enormously impacted and affected by the way their parents or grandparents spoke or did not speak about the Holocaust. It's very important to understand the transgenerational impact of the Holocaust. It's important to understand the power of the sites where the Holocaust took place. I worked with the Foreign Ministry on a project to memorialize Holocaust mass graves in Western Ukraine, which is a subject that's barely been addressed. And we can use the objects left behind. Benjamin mentioned that I'm now working on the board of the Jewish Digital Cultural Recovery Project. And we're trying to assemble a central database of all the objects that were stolen by the Nazis. Just imagine, we don't have it. We have no idea of how much art and household items, cultural objects, were stolen in a systematic, organized fashion by the Nazi regime and their collaborators, and given away, sold off, used for profit. We just don't know. And I think learning more about those stories, these are still largely unwritten chapters. we can keep the memory alive and compelling. And above all, we need to support Jewish life today. And I think this is the most important thing. Not everyone will have the opportunity to meet one of Europe's 2 million Jews. I mean, it's a very small population at this point, or the 100,000 in Germany. But there are ways to learn more, to reach out, and of course, to meet people if you're interested.
Mr. Rosenfeld, from your research, are people who tend to be anti-Semitic also tempted to be racist? So is there sort of a tendency that people who approach problems by stereotyping others, by sort of putting them down, also do this in other fashions? Or is anti-Semitism something unique, something special?
You ask a basic question. The answer, again, is mixed. It'll vary from person to person, incident to incident. Some of your viewers may be familiar with an incident that took place a few years ago at a mostly Black church in the town in South Carolina, where a young fellow, a white fellow, sat down for Bible study with the people congregated there. He was very well received. They were polite to him, courteous, and so on and so forth. At the end of the Bible study session, he pulled out a gun and murdered something like 9 or 10 of the people there. He left behind, as many of these people do, a posting on social media in which he set forth his views, and basically he wanted to create a race war in America between blacks and whites, but also between Christians and Jews. So what was obvious to me in looking at his document, it's still available online, is that he hated blacks, he hated Jews. Basically, he was a white supremacist and Christian nationalist, and we see some of that. So with regard to people of that sort, the hatred ideologically conformed targets more than one group. In other respects, it singles out Jews as Jews. If I may, Mr. Henze, for just 2 minutes perhaps, especially for people in your German audience who may not know these, I'll just mention that in October of 2018, a guy no one heard of named Robert Bowers stormed into a synagogue in Pittsburgh where people had gathered for Sabbath prayers. He shot 17 people, shouting, "All Jews must die," and 11 of them did die. They were murdered. It was the deadliest attack on Jews in American history. Exactly 6 months later to the day, another fellow no one had heard of named John Ernest went into a synagogue near San Diego in California. The town was called Poway, shouting also, "Jews are ruining the world." And he shot several of them. He was captured. He was quoted as saying, "I feel no remorse. I wish I killed more. I am honored to be the one to send these vile anti-Humans into the pit of fire where they shall remain for eternity." Very quickly, on December 10th, 2019, a couple of people, themselves black, stormed into a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, New Jersey, guns blazing. They killed 4 people. In their car outside, the police discovered a bomb that was meant to blow up a synagogue nearby. Finally, on that same month, on the 7th night of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, another guy named Grafton Thomas entered a rabbi's home in Monsey, New York, not too far from New York City. He stabbed and slashed 5 of the people congregated there with a machete. One of them, an elderly rabbi, lay unconscious for months in the hospital and died. Now, it's not possible to generalize about all these people, The first two certainly were white supremacists. The last two subscribed to an extreme version of something called Black Hebrew Israelite ideology, which regards Jews as imposter Jews. And they somehow claim authenticity for themselves, or there's nothing Jewish about them. So it varies from case to case, person to person. Sometimes we find a generalized hatred encompassing various groups, more recently Asian Americans in the United States. Sometimes it's targeted solely on Jews.
Thank you, Professor Rosenfeld. I'm reading some of the questions and sometimes more comments here in the chat. They deal with the question of how to bring the memory of the Holocaust and the Shoah sort of in our current time. And one comment by Michael Polger says, we also recognize the problem of Holocaust denial is paired with the more common problem of Holocaust distortion, or even Holocaust minimization. I mean, we see this in the Corona protests when people show up with a sort of the yellow star. And also another comment says, well, there are a lot of teachers who would love to educate more about the Holocaust, but because the curriculum is so full with other things, they simply don't find the time. And to add a third point, I mean, it's not just about educating more about the Holocaust, but educating how to deal with situations when on the schoolyard, situations might occur where a teacher hears or schoolmates hear denial or distortion or minimization of the Holocaust. So there's a set of questions dealing, how do we really bring this culture of memory, Erinnerungskultur, as we tend to be proud of here in Europe, can be transferred into a new age, Deidre? Oh, we need your microphone.
Sorry. First, hello to Ellen Rosenbaum, who says she's from St. Louis, which is where I'm from. I think the problem, as I mentioned before, is that teachers are not trained to deal with issues of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. It's less the idea of how many school units they receive to do it. It happens all the time. They're confronted with it all the time. And they don't know what to do. They often feel very alone. Actually, we did surveys at the American Jewish Committee Berlin office of teachers in Berlin, for instance, and also in North Rhine-Westphalia and Baden-Württemberg. And we determined that the teachers just don't have the tools to know what to do. The schools aren't geared toward dealing with the problems. They often feel, individual teachers feel left alone by the administrators who also don't receive the training. So I think that there's a whole series of things that can be done to address it. In addition, I do think that when I say more emphasis should be put on the Holocaust, I think different ways of approaching it, and it should be done in conjunction with understanding more about Jewish life. And one of the recommendations that I've always made that the city of Berlin has an official program about anti-Semitism is every student should have the opportunity to visit a Holocaust memorial site as well as a site of Jewish life today. In Berlin, that's possible. It's not possible everywhere. But I think it's very important to help teachers understand and pupils who Jews are, what life, what we're about, to combat some of those ingrained stereotypes that these even small children are coming to school with. There's an enormous amount that can be done. And I think the other comment about Holocaust distortion and minimalization is very important. There's very few people who deny outright the Holocaust. And I'm sure Alvin can say more about this. It's like people saying, I'm not an anti-Semite, but it's about the degrees to which people are trying to diminish the role and importance of the Holocaust and make comparisons that are not necessarily legitimate in a way to say, well, it was just another misfortune that happened on the path in history and let's move on. And by losing that memory, the more we would approach it like this, then we lose an enormous amount and we lose the chance for Jewish life to flourish in Europe. All right, now you're on mute.
Thank you. I'd like to pass this question over to Professor Rosenfeld. I mean, one of the challenges to this culture of memory, to this Erinnerungskultur, comes from post-colonial studies who say, well, the focus on the Holocaust sort of overshadows the necessary sort of memory of other genocides, of slavery, of colonialism, and so on. And so we have a debate sort of about the uniqueness of the Shoah and the Holocaust versus sort of linking different kinds of genocide in history to each other. And this is a very polarized debate. And I think it's helpful if you could give us an American perspective on it. What's relevant on this debate? What do we need to know about this debate if it's not just an academic discourse?
Right. I'm familiar with the debate, and I've been a participant in the debate as well. There's nothing that tells me my own, let's say, devotion to studying the Holocaust, teaching the Holocaust, writing about the Holocaust, should prevent anyone else from studying, teaching, and writing about other cases of mass violence in history. There's something bogus about that argument. In fact, what makes it an ugly and bitter argument is that it ends up being a competition of suffering populations. And there's more than enough suffering to go around through history for them to be competitive. We know that. So part of me just doesn't get it. I don't quite understand why people would object to courses I might offer on the Holocaust. I do every year. I have no objection to people offering courses, let's say, on slavery in America. Both of them belong to the knowledge of all of us alive. The debate, however, continues. On the one hand, I'm afraid that a lot of people have just had enough of the Jews and their sorrows. They don't want to hear any more about it. I don't have respect for that point of view, but I'm certain that it exists. Otherwise, I do hear from time to time that Holocaust studies have to be encompassed within a larger framework of genocide studies. If one result of that is for us to better understand the Holocaust and related catastrophes, it's all to the good. If, on the other hand, the result of that is to dilute unique aspects about the Holocaust, that's not good. The Claims Conference, which sits in New York City, last year published the results of a survey regarding what Americans know about the Holocaust. And the results were very dismal, I must say. 48% of Americans never heard of Auschwitz. Auschwitz was the largest killing site in human history, as far as we know. The Holocaust is a very copiously documented crime. We don't lack for sources, but almost 1 out of 2 Americans never heard of Auschwitz. That's not a good state of affairs. So how to redress it? Deidre put her finger on it for sure. Education, education, education. Many states in America have mandated Holocaust education as required, but then they didn't fund it in their budgets. So someone has to teach the teachers. And unless you have a budget to do that, it's not going to happen. The same, as Deidre mentioned, should happen in theological schools, seminaries, and the like. I'm not in despair about any of this, but we have our work cut out for us. When we look at certain countries in Eastern Europe who are undergoing a period of neo-nationalism and populism, rewriting their histories, particularly during World War II, they certainly do minimize and distort aspects of the catastrophes visited upon the Jews in places like Poland, Lithuania, and elsewhere. There is a very strong debate going on these days regarding a scholar named Jan Grabowski. I'm sure you've heard word of it in Germany, The poor guy is embattled because he published a book with another scholar, Barbara Engelking, in Poland, which in fact shows that while most of the killings in Poland were at the hands of Nazis, a fair number were also done by Polish citizens. And that's considered not just intolerable, but according to certain people, just about illegal. Well, when you have anything of that sort, you're not going to get a truthful history.
With one eye, I'm also trying to follow the chat. I read a lot of very interesting, fascinating, very precise comments regarding the educational challenge dealing with the Holocaust. I can't read them all. I'm sure you can read it also in the chat. We should take a look at it after our meeting. I found one question that brings us to the topic that for some is the elephant in the room, and this is Israel, the state of Israel. Some say criticizing Israel is already labeled as being anti-Semitic. Where is the line between criticizing politics, political steps of the Israeli government, developments in the Israeli society in a legitimate way, and to sort of switch the border and become anti-Semitic? Where would you draw this line, Deidre? You need to turn on the...
I would draw the line at comparisons that are so exaggerated that their standards applied to Israel alone and not to any other country in the world. I think that there are exaggerations that are at play here that reflect certain attitudes toward Israel that mask projections against Israelis as Jews, attitudes toward Jews. There's not always an easy line, but I think there's also a line when the existence of the state of Israel, the right of existence, is denied directly or indirectly. What other country in the world even has to debate its right to existence? And that's the point where I think those of us who work in this area would say there's anti-Semitic tendencies going on here. And this is the reason that the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, BDS as it's called, which has as its ultimate goal the dissolution of the Jewish state of Israel, is an anti-Semitic movement. Does this mean that everybody who supports BDS is an anti-Semite as such? No, of course not. But it means that it is an anti-Semitic movement at heart, and that people who support it have to recognize that they're supporting an anti-Semitic movement.
Alvin Rosenfeld, free speech is one of sort of the pillars of the American culture and the American political system. How is the BDS movement debated in the US in this context of this high notion of free speech?
Yes, it comes up time and again, so you're right to call attention to it, Mr. Henze, often irrationally. Israel just celebrated its 73rd birthday, Yom HaAtzmaut. I personally rejoiced on that day, as I do over the existence of the state of Israel. There is no Jewish future worthy the name without the state of Israel. Impossible. 1 out of every 2 Jews alive today, including, by the way, my daughter and some of my grandchildren, live in the state of Israel. The Jewish future is inseparable apart from the state of Israel. Israel, like all countries, is far from being perfect, although there's a great deal about it to admire. What you referred to as legitimate criticism is certainly not anti-Semitic. The question is what defines legitimacy and not, and at what point does the question of free speech enter the picture? And there, I think it was Deidre earlier referred to the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which says in so many words, and this is a very close paraphrase, if not a direct quote, that criticism of Israel, similar to criticism directed against other countries, is not anti-Semitic and should not be regarded as anti-Semitic. As for BDS, it's a loose umbrella organization, but at the very top of BDS, many of its leaders call not for a better Israel or reform of this policy or that policy, but let me quote just a couple people. One is a man named Asad Abu Khalil, and I quote him. He says, the real aim of BDS is to bring down the state of Israel. That should be stated as an unambiguous goal. There should not be any equivocation on the subject. Justice and freedom for the Palestinians are incompatible with the existence of the state of Israel. Another top leader, in fact, the co-founder of BDS, Omar Barghouti, is on record favoring, and I quote him, what he called a euthanasia for Israel. And I quote him again. He says, definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. No Palestinian will ever accept a Jewish state in Palestine. That's where criticism belongs. And the more of it, the better. Anyone who calls for the end of the state of Israel, by the IHRA definition, and by most people's account of the future possibility of Jewish life, especially 3 generations after the Shoah, without the state of Israel, is kidding himself.
We have a question by Daniel Loaf, directed toward Deidre. She wants to know how you view the media environment, and not to mention certain names because that won't help us here because most would know the names. Where would you draw the line for media, who certainly wouldn't say get rid of the state of Israel, but they're also sort of under debate when it comes to being anti-Israel or being anti-Semitic? Where would you draw the line for criticizing Israel in a way that media also would do toward the politics of other states? The commentaries toward other states and governments tend to be also quite harsh and quite rigid. Where would be sort of the line where it becomes illegitimate when it comes to Israel?
I'm a former journalist, so I'm very cautious about saying we need to draw the line. I mean, we do have free speech. So I think the issue is more blame and shame. We need to point out unceasingly when there are articles that are completely one-sided, that are anti-Semitic in intent and nature, and ensure that first of all, that the media at hand is brought to task, that it's well known. There is a commission that one can appeal to. It's an honor code, but you can. But I think to try and reach the editors, to let them know what you think, to make sure that they published different points of view is very important. And should there be content that really does cross lines of what's allowed under what's considered anti-Semitic speech in Germany, then to press charges against cases like that. I don't think the chances are very good, but that's no reason not to try. It's very important. I think overall in Germany, it's a mixed picture compared especially to other European countries. There are a number of media that regularly do report in a fair way on Israel with interest on Jewish life. But that's not to say that there aren't numerous articles that are very one-sided and that create a false understanding, I think, both of Israel and Jewish life. I would just like to say with the criticism of Israel, I'm waiting for the day when we have the term not just Israel criticism in the German dictionary, Israel Kritik, but also Palästinenser Kritik. Now, meaning the criticism of Palestinian Authority. that's a facetious comment of mine, I know, but it's to point out the very one-sided nature of this constant attempt to say we have to condemn Israel. Do we have to condemn France? Do we have to condemn the Palestinians? Do we have to condemn? I mean, the very obsessive nature of this campaign already, I think, reveals some of the problems as to why there are moments when it does cross over into direct it feeds on anti-Semitic stereotypes.
We have a debate whether the state should act in these circumstances. So we had the parliamentary vote on the resolution against BDS. It includes parts that says the state shouldn't give room and give the buildings for events where even BDS proponents would be on the podium. So is this something left to civil society, or is it what role does the state has to play in fighting anti-Semitism?
Who do you want?
I think I guess we would get different perspectives from the American and from the European side. So I would like to hear both of you.
Sure. Alvin, do you want to start?
Yes, I don't think the state can define and legislate for in this regard. While I sit in America, I do keep an eye on developments in Germany and other European countries. The person within, the scholar within Germany whom I've learned most from is Monika Schwarz-Friesel in Berlin. She's published widely with a number of researchers. And in reading her research, what strikes me over and above everything else is the visceral element, the strongly impassioned emotional element of certain kinds of German anti-Israelism. Just as I mentioned before, it's not a perfect solution, but one way to address anti-Semitism is matzo ball soup. One way may be that could open the eyes of people in Germany to the real nature of Israel is for them to go to Israel and spend some time in the country and take a look at it and see for themselves what they see, and also to read more deeply. Another thing that strikes me about, not all, but many of Israel's critics, its most severe critics, its most extreme critics, is how poorly informed they are. They talk about Israel without knowing much at all about the history that gave birth to the state and what's happened over the last 73 years. So I would put personal experience and education over and beyond legislation myself, which isn't to say legislation may not play a role. I think it could, but I don't want to be, I don't want to try to say much about the internal German situation. Deidre is far better positioned to do that.
Thank you, Alvin. I think that the civil society in Germany plays a key role in fighting anti-Semitism. And this is one of the positive highlights of what's happened in the last 20 years, is that there's been dozens, if not hundreds, of civil society organizations that have emerged to focus on fighting anti-Semitism, bringing more understanding about Jewish life, helping people understand more about Israel, in addition to existing structures that do important work. Society for Christian Jewish Cooperation, the German Israeli societies, who consistently do a great deal of work and pull in young people to help them understand more. I mean, I think it's quite unique in Europe, in fact, the degree to which civil society is engaged in fighting anti-Semitism, promoting Jewish life, and the security of Jewish life in Germany. And I think it's extremely important. The German government is starting to support some of these groups more, to give them more funding and more long-term funding. It could be a lot more, but it's a beginning, because the culture of funding here is different than in the US. It's not, you're not as likely to find private donors to finance these sort of things. And I think it's good that the government is engaged in this area. So civil society is really a key, and civil society also became engaged because of in part, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the so-called OSCE. This is a 57 or 58 member state now organization that was founded during the Cold War to try and overcome the Cold War with civil society means. And in the OSCE, civil society groups can register, for instance, to be part of conferences. This is different than the EU or the UN. And the OSCE has addressed the issue of combating anti-Semitism repeatedly in the last 15 years. In 2004, there was a very important high-level conference that the OSCE sponsored in Berlin. That was the first major international effort to focus attention on the then dramatically rising numbers of attacks, also physical, brutal attacks, anti-Semitic attacks. And since then, I think we've seen a whole culture of engagement with civil society groups who can participate in the OSCE. But in general, I think that it's an extremely important part of the quotient in dealing with anti-Semitism.
I think this part of what you said is just an answer to the question of Michael Polgar. How are UN reports on and calls for anti-Semitism education being put into practice by member nations? I think that what the OECD is doing is right on this point. We have just 2 more minutes left, and I would like sort of for the final question to ask both of you, what could we learn from each other? So what could the American debate learn from the European way to tackle anti-Semitism and to deal with anti-Semitism? What could we learn in Europe from the American debate and from the American discourse? Alvin, you want to start?
Sure. First of all, I've come to know Deidre Berger well over the last several years, and I have worked with her time and again. I look forward to more. I've also done the same with a number of other German colleagues. My institute runs major conferences on global anti-Semitism. We have more participants from Germany than from any other country. So I take heart from that, particularly among younger German scholars. There's more interest, more competence, more engagement with them than I find, let's say, with scholars from France or other countries. So the more cooperation, the more we look in common at a phenomenon that now has global ramifications, the more we learn from one another. That will continue. The challenges are real and they're big and they're ongoing. A lot depends on the larger environment and what happens in Europe, in America. Right now, there are a lot of worrisome trends in both places, and they far transcend the Jewish questions. They involve, in my country, gun violence to a large degree, etc., etc. But the more we continue to talk with one another, meet with one another, read one another, teach with one another, the better.
I would echo what Alvin Rosenfeld says. He and his institute have sponsored a number of important conferences that bring together a transatlantic group of scholars, and I include Israel in that group. I think that it's essential that we approach this from a transatlantic perspective to fight anti-Semitism. We need all the forces we can marshal, and we can reinforce one another. Members of parliament in the US can deal with members of parliament in other countries. Civil society groups can exchange, scholars can exchange. We need much more interaction on a transatlantic level because it's a global phenomenon. Anti-Semitism, as we know, and even if it expresses itself differently in part in the US or in Germany, at its heart, as Alvin explained, anti-Semitism is an age-old phenomenon. It finds new forms of expression, and we need to work together to ensure that they don't spread and that we reach more people to understand the danger to democracy of anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosenfeld. Thank you, Deidre Berger, for a fantastic discussion. Just 75 minutes. I could go on for much longer, but I got already some kind of warning signals that we might be sort of kicked out of the Zoom room if we continue. We have to continue this. We have to continue this because the challenges are so real and are so concrete that we should spend much more time on each individual problem that we are dealing with. Diversity, dealing with sort of the generational shift in dealing with in tackling the memory of the Holocaust and so on. Just wanted to close with a brief footnote because Professor Rosenfeld mentioned the murderous nature of anti-Semitism with the attacks on synagogues and places that we also have had in Germany and in Europe, in Halle in Germany and other places in Europe. I was deeply moved by a story I read about a medical professor in Pittsburgh, one of the survivors of the synagogue, and he had to treat on the intensive care unit white supremacists and to fight for their lives. So when it comes to social encounter between these murderous ideology of anti-Semitism and meeting sort of not face to face, there were two people interconnected with each other in the most extreme way. And the story about this doctor fighting for the life of these white supremacists was something of the most moving stories of the pandemic year that I had read over the last couple of months. So I think the nature of people who do not hate back, but to take people as human beings is probably the strongest resource in fighting anti-Semitism. And with this, I would leave it for tonight. I hope to see you again in this conference Zoom room, but maybe sometimes in person where we can travel again. Deidre Bergers, thank you so much. Professor Rosenfeld, thank you so much. Thank you for all the comments. It was more comments than questions tonight, but they are very, very informing about certain projects that you're doing in your local communities or universities or educational places. Thank you to our hosts, the America House and the NRW and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, and hope to see you soon. Good night.
Good night.
Good
Thank
afternoon.
you. Thank
Bye.
you, Arndt.
Thank you.
And thanks to the America House and to the Adenauer Foundation.
Good.